but I was hoping for something a little more exciting. So lots of friendly faces. That's always nice. It's always nice to have the first session in the morning. People are either not here or haven't fallen asleep, although depending on how the donut sugar crash goes, I might lose some people. So today the session we're talking about is entities elsewhere, or external entities in Drupal 8. My name is Ron, if you don't know me. I'm a senior solutions architect at Acquia. I've been using Drupal for quite a while and enjoying it, which is always fun. And I'm in all the places, usually as RL Northcutt. So if you have questions, criticism, you can heckle now if you want, or you can save it for the end. That's fine as well. So let's jump into it. So today, entities elsewhere, we're talking about external entities. And we're going to go through and do an overview of kind of what that concept is, what it means. We're going to talk a bit about entity storage, because that's really the core of what we're talking about today. And we got a couple of different examples we're going to look at. The first one is the external entity module. Has anyone ever seen this before? The external entity module? So my follow-up question is that anyone used it is probably going to land flat as well. Great. It's interesting. We're also going to be looking at a custom storage handler. That's where we're going to dig in a little bit deeper, take a look at some of the code. That's going to be pretty fun. And then just some next steps and other things, where to go from there, and then time for questions at the end. So just FYI, as evidenced by the fact that no one here has even heard of the external entities module, as also evidenced by the fact that through all of my incessant Googling, I really was able to find almost nothing about any of this. So this is off the map. This is crazy territory. A lot of people have heard of this idea. Some people have actually done it, but those are the people that are really, really good, and that's not me. So I had to stumble around and get some of this stuff figured out. So if you do try and do this yourself, just be warned, it can be a bit messy, but it's okay. So as an overview, what we're really doing is we're taking the entity API, which has abstracted a lot of stuff out, and we can break into pieces, and specifically the fact that we can change the storage handler for an entity. So what that means is you have an entity, and when it goes to load or even to create or delete, do anything, it's going to go to the storage handler to figure out how to do that. Now by default, out of the box, when you have any type of custom content entity, or if you're using content types, etc., we're using MySQL, the database that's in Drupal. And that works great. However, sometimes you might want to do something else. So in an example we're going to look at later, we actually have an API that we're trying to get data from. And historically, a lot of times what we would have done is just import that data in to Drupal, and it's a first-class citizen. That's still a great way to go. And depending on the situation, it could be a lot easier. But it would be great if, number one, we could leave that stuff out there so that we don't have to keep migrating over and over again. We always have the latest and greatest. It would also be great, number two, if the amount of stuff that's out there in that API or that external database is huge. You don't want to blow up your own database just so that you can access some stuff. We can go out and we can grab that stuff in other ways. A lot of people are doing that with in a decoupled manner, or with React, things like that. You can make API calls and do cool things like that. But with this approach, we still get to take advantage of all of the good stuff that Entity API provides. So we can manage, potentially manage the way that those fields are displayed. We can potentially add additional fields. We can go in and work in a relatively simple, all things considered, views integration. So for the people actually using Drupal, these external entities are just like the ones here. They don't have to know that there's something crazy going on. But it is pretty crazy. So as with lots of things, the devil is in the details. And there are a lot of details here. So what we're going to look at is just kind of scratching the surface. I actually took this picture this morning It was about 2 in the morning with my selfie of me trying to figure out how to make this work. So this is what happens when you feed a Ron after midnight. So talk about entity storage a little bit. If we go back and we look at Drupal 7, we actually did have the ability to swap out field storage with entities. And that was really cool. And we did see people kind of starting to do that a little bit. And this enabled us to take that field data and actually store it or have it served from pretty much anywhere. So I know some people, there was a time when Mongo was like super hot and really cool, and there's some people in the community that were pushing it really hard. This is one of the ways that they were trying to kind of get stuff in there. And sometimes it's really great. The problem with this is that because it was at the field level, you could potentially be trying to pull in data or do queries across multiple backends, which is difficult at least, and probably largely impossible at best. So this created a lot of issues. So in Drupal 8, what we've done is we've actually gone from field-based storage to entity-based storage. So this means that all of the field data for that one entity has the same storage handler. This makes that querying thing much easier because it always knows how to grab the data for this particular entity. Now, I don't know if anyone has noticed that in 8, we can no longer share fields between different entities. This is why. So if you've seen that and you've wondered why, as I did, this is the reason. Some people say that that's a really good thing. I can go both ways. It doesn't hurt me, but the idea of sharing fields is pretty cool. But it's okay because the advantages we're getting from this are worth it. Each entity type has its own dedicated storage handler. By default, it's going to be tying to either a key value store or it's going to be tying to MySQL. And that's responsible for all of the CRUD at the end of the day. And in fact, when you start digging into the storage handler, I was personally surprised at how much of what entities is doing is actually happening at that level. And it's completely abstracted away, which can be kind of scary.
Does that optimize the reads and writes to the database? Because traditionally, I remember in Q7, you would have like lots and lots and lots of different tables for every single field, and then lots and lots of joins. Has that changed at all?
I don't know about I'm not too deep on the query API,
okay.
So I couldn't say for sure.
Fair enough.
What I can say is that as I was experimenting with this, you can still take advantage of caching. So you can actually take advantage of the caching API to help speed things up and make things faster, which is pretty cool because once you grab that resource from that external source once, you can kind of keep it around for a while, so you don't have to keep going back over and over again. Let's see, this is defined when you define your entity type definition. Has anybody done a custom entity? Has anybody not done a custom entity with using Drupal console? Because that's the only way I've done it. Yeah. Okay, some people are even more hardcore. So it does that stuff for you. You don't even have to worry about it. One note, and I did find a little snippet of code out there. I didn't incorporate it in my demo. You can actually use hook entity type alter to change the storage handler. So you can actually change the storage handler of an existing entity that you have, which is pretty cool. So keep that in mind. That could be handy. Alrighty. So the first thing I want to look at is the external entity module, which is located here. I've actually had my eye on this for quite some time and have never really had a chance to play with it. In fact, that's one of the reasons I proposed this session, so I'd have a good excuse. The thing to keep in mind about this is that this is, and they say it themselves, this is really more of a proof of concept, example, testing kind of thing. This may or may not ever get to a full release candidate or fully stable module. We will see. But it's interesting in what it does. The nice thing is that it provides, as we'll see in a moment, a UI for helping manage some of this stuff, which is actually very clever. The downside to that is, as we all know, once you start abstracting things away to make them very flexible, the code level itself becomes very complicated. So I'm not going to dig into the code of the module. You're welcome to do that on your own time. But the code that we are going to be looking at, I've tried to simplify as much as possible so nobody gets lost, especially me. Okay. So let's take a quick look at this. Okay, so right here you'll see I've got this list, and I'll go ahead and refresh it just to show you it's live. And what I'm doing is we're pulling in, it's one of the examples they have in the issue queue, we're actually pulling in a small amount of content from Wikipedia. In this case, it's a query for CMS systems. This is all just using standard Drupal stuff, the table builder, the links. You'll notice it's kind of cool. I've got devel turned on, and it knows to throw that operation in there. This is very bare bones, so like even if I dig into one of these, we're not going to see a whole lot. But one of the things that we are seeing is that we've got this page ID. This page ID is coming from the API along with the title, but the page ID is actually tied to a field on this this entity. But let's take a look at how that works. So if we go back up here. Now, the cool thing about this is that what the module does is it creates a custom entity, and it allows you to define different bundles. Bundle is, for those who don't know, is like a content type. So you have node as your entity, and then you have content types. Here, external entity is your primary entity, and then the bundles are each of these types that you put in place. And so we can create different ones, we can manage fields, etc. But if we jump in and edit this is where the interesting magic starts to happen. So I've actually got a couple of different fields that I've added, body and page ID. I couldn't get body working, but I didn't spend too much time. But this is where that page ID is coming from. So what I actually have is a field defined that I just added myself into, just like you'd add to any other entity through the UI. And then here I'm mapping that to the values that are being returned. So I went with the Wikipedia example because that's the only one that was available in the issue queue. There's not a lot of documentation here. But there is the ability to do this with JSON in theory. So hopefully someone can test that out and let me know. You can see right here there's two clients. There's the wiki one, which apparently is quite easy, and then there's also a REST. It's a plugin, so you can actually define your own clients for external entity if you need to. We can choose the format. In this case, we're sticking with JSON, and then the endpoint that we're hitting. The thing that's really cool about this is it actually is kind of built around some of the stuff that I didn't have time to flesh everything out in my custom storage handler. But things like the fact that it's got the ability to put in the paging calls so that you can actually cycle through and page through that stuff in the UI is actually very interesting. And it's abstracted enough you can actually go in and modify that stuff. We don't need API keys for Wikipedia, but if you did, it helps to manage that as well. And then you can also put in place parameters for both listing and retrieving individual items. So this is, for example, where I'm telling it to look for content management systems. Very interesting stuff.
Question?
Yes, sir.
So are those things just built into the external entity, those parameters down there in the vertical tab bar? Mm-hmm. Or are these things that you had to look at the Wikipedia API to determine what to put in here?
Those came from Wikipedia API. Yeah. And actually, if we look, this is the same call that I'm actually making. And you'll see I'm only returning the page ID and the title, which is why those are the only things that are mapped. So basically what the external entity module is doing is providing a way for me to make this call, and you can see up here, you can see my actual query string at the top. So the external entity module is preparing the query stream, it's making the calls, it will do the paging for me, it's taking the JSON that's returned back, it's mapping it to this entity that we have in Drupal, and then it's building out the table and the individual display. And all of that is happening without us saving any of this in the database.
So in some ways, it's doing some of the same things that the entity construction kit, the ECK module is doing, in that it gives you an interface to create entities without having to use Drupal.
Without having to write code.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But this has all the remote stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, a very, very cool project. It would be very interesting to play with this a little bit more, maybe extend it, maybe contribute. And if you have a project, it could be worth looking at. Awesome. Any questions about that? Yes?
I had a quick question. Did I understand correctly, you can add fields that are local to the endpoint or not? I mean,
No, not really. Because remember, all of the
okay, so
the
all
entity
that's-
storage for
that's
the
right.
entire
Yeah,
entity.
that's right. So we're at 8. So all
Right.
the field storage is
Exactly.
on the end.
Now, you might be able to hack something. I mean, you can always hack something,
So you,
right?
you can't bundle external and internal together then?
I don't think so.
But if you used a reference, like an entity reference,
That's
you
what
could
I would
have-
do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably go that route, which gives you a lot more control. Yeah. Awesome.
What if you're using it? What if you're needing to do an integration with an existing database?
Well, it depends on how you're doing it, right? I mean, the traditional way is that you would add another database connection in your settings.php, and then in your code, wherever you're doing it, you would change to that connection, do the stuff you needed to do, and then switch back to your default. So that could very well be the best way to go. If you have some type of endpoint that you can hit, like you've got some thin API client in front of that database, then something like this might be better, or going in and just migrating stuff and setting up once or twice a day to do the updates, something like that. So I mean, you still have a lot of different options, and I think there's a reason why there's not a whole lot of people doing this. This is kind of weird, but I think there's a lot of potential here that's still untapped.
I mean, if your only choice for consumption is an API, this is really the only way to approach it, right?
I mean, you could still migrate import from an
Right,
API.
right. But if you wanted real-time data,
Right.
this would be the way to go. There's
Yeah.
not really another clear option.
Exactly, and it does create some different challenges.
Yeah.
Because how do you find an entity that doesn't exist? You have to know how to find it, which means that's where the query API comes in. You
Right.
got to have that interface.
What about, you mentioned that you could potentially cache up the stuff.
Mhm.
Now the question comes up about cache invalidation, right?
It's all the same. Cache tags. You can set the life.
Migration.
Yeah. So
But your data comes from somewhere else, so so if it's cached up locally, you don't know that the source data may have changed.
It's-
So you need to wait for the source data to come back
Potentially.
to Drupal and say, hey,
yeah.
here are these cache tags.
I mean, potentially, yeah. That would be a little more involved, but it could be done.
Is there a mechanism for that?
Out of the box, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. Is there a question over here?
Yeah, you were mentioning about the caching, and then you touched on importing. I want to kind of clarify on what you meant by that. Could this be integrated with like a DAM or a document management system and then importing files from that system? Or this, I mean, because we were looking at storing it in a database.
Hmm.
I'm just wondering about the import application.
Yeah, I don't see why not. Although, if I was integrating with the DAM, I would probably use either file or media API, and either set it up so that when I am searching and grabbing it, that it pulls it in, or it sets up an external reference, so it just knows how to either make the image style changes or just says, which is what in my demo I'm doing. I'm just grabbing the URL for the image, and I'm just rendering it as HTML. Is there a question here?
What happens with this if the API changes, the schema changes, does it fail gracefully? Does it?
Oh, I doubt it.
Works flawlessly every time.
It does. It's perfect every time. No. It will break. I broke it several times.
Okay.
Yeah, but we can fix it, right? I mean, as a community, the big we.
But if the key points of the API that you're using in your calls don't change and they do additive
Right.
stuff or remove things you're ignoring anyways, it shouldn't break, right?
Yeah, and if you've got a good API that's versioned, and
Yeah.
I mean that's why we do those things, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So if you did it this way and you didn't have caching and you had a view that displayed 20 extra URLs and they take 2 seconds each to respond, it would take a long time to build that page?
Potentially.
Okay.
Yeah. Like in the example we're going to see next, they don't have a way of querying. You can do searching, and you can do and you can search by different fields, which is very cool. But they don't have a way to say, make one call and give me these 20 things, which is kind of the opposite of how Drupal works, and we'll talk about that. So in that particular case, you'd have to make 20 calls, all one after each other, which is why caching becomes really important.
So, okay, so if you're doing it this way as opposed to the React way, if
Mhm.
you do the React way, all that latency would be on the client end.
Yeah.
Whereas this way, it's all going through the server. So the
Correct.
server's making these API calls, not the client, which potentially could become a huge bottleneck if you had hundreds of people hitting this thing and the 2-second latency is going on. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, if you have caching
right,
and you set it up right, now if you've got 100 people that want the same resource,
right.
one person gets it, everybody gets it.
Yeah, if a
not for free,
5-minute
but
dirty read scenario
Sure.
was good, then you're probably way better off with this.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
it could be. And really here, I mean, if you're going with something with React, what you really want to do is you want to push it to the client side, and you want to have a lot of control over that.
Yeah.
Here, we're abstracting a lot of that control to the Drupal site builder admin person, so that they can grab entities or create views. Or until I broke it this morning, I was also even taking the fields and, just like you would do for managed display, defining how those fields were going to be output and what order and stuff. I mean, I also have a template on top of mine, so that kind of blows that out of the water anyway. But the raw power is what you'd expect from Drupal. Okay, so let's take a look at a custom storage channel. I think it's going to be interesting, and we're going to see some more of this, how this stuff works. So, that's the other one from this morning. Yeah, that was
When the coffee ran out.
that's right, diving into code. So that's what we're going to do now. So I will show you the quick and dirty, and then we'll dig into how that works. So today happens to also be, in addition to Texas Camp, it's also it's not my son's birthday, but it's his birthday party, and he's really into magic. I may or may not be into magic myself. So the idea I had that was pretty cool was, wouldn't it be great if we could use an API that feeds out information about magic cards? Because I don't want to have to go, and I can go download all of these, and I can import it.
Magic the Gathering card game.
Yes.
For those who don't know.
Thank you, who are not as geeky as me. But what I really was interested in here was the ability to go through and be able to, select different cards that I liked or that he liked, or put together decks or inventory or whatever, without having to have all of that data in the database. All we need is just one little reference ID, and then we can grab all of the information anytime we need it. We can cache it, we can reuse it. So, does anybody here know Magic the Gathering? Does anybody have a card, like the name of a card? Pick a card, any card.
Phased Untouchable.
Phased Untouchable. Let's see if we can make that one work.
Phage. There you go.
Oh, Phage?
Yeah. P-H-A-P-G-E, I think.
P-H-A-P-G-E. That one's too weird for me.
Okay.
I'm not spelling it right. That's the problem.
How about Force of Nature?
There you go.
Force of Nature. Let's see if we can do that one.
Any of the sliver cards? No. Someone's built a squirrel deck in here.
Okay, here we go. Good call. Force of Nature. So basically, the way that this API works, and I'll zoom in a little bit here, the IDs are actually the name of the card with dashes and spaces, which is kind of cool, but it's also kind of crappy, because you have to know exactly what that thing is, right? And there's all this great information. So what I've done is I've created an entity somewhere here. Where are we? I've created an entity that's pulling in the title, the URL for the image. I'm not rendering. I don't have this in my local here. This is just being pulled. The cost, the colors, the text, the rarity. I could do the flavor text. I could do the different, like, what are they called? Like every year they come out with the 2 different versions. Anyway, I'm only pulling in some data here. But the interesting thing is that I'm pulling in a URL. I'm pulling in some text. Pulling in some long text. I'm pulling in a list of stuff like the colors or the type of card, etc. And again, we can manage a lot of this stuff within Drupal. So let's go take a look at this. So the way that I approached this was I just used Drupal console to generate a custom module and a custom entity. And from there, I started hacking on it. And would keep going until I broke something, and then I'd fix it, and then break it, and fix it, and eventually made it all the way down the path. So let's take a look at the actual entity itself. That's kind of the place to start. That needs to be a little bigger, doesn't it? What's this? I just had this working where I could zoom in.
It's a presentation.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Is that kind of readable? Okay, so what I did was the entity the entity itself is just mtg_card. So you're going to see that over and over again. And a lot of this is either exactly the way it was spit out by Drupal console, or I've removed stuff. There are only a few places that I've added, but you can see I added a storage handler, and that storage handler is custom. And we'll jump into that next. But everything else is pretty much out of the box. And then here you can see this is the core URL that's being generated for each individual item. I actually created my own route. We'll look at that in a minute in a controller, just because that was an easier way to get there for me. But ideally, we'd want to stay as close to Entity API as possible, in my opinion. So let's take a look down here. Base field definitions, just very quickly. This is all the normal stuff you'd see when you're creating a custom entity. Nothing different here. The ID, the name. Here you can see I've got the listing of the different types of cards as an allowed value. So the nice thing about that is that when I'm letting Drupal render it, I can actually go in and change the value versus the key that's being spit out. In this case, making it uppercase, for example. All of this is just the stuff that you'd normally see. A lot of the other methods that we have either been truncated, like get created time. I'm not taking advantage of that. That's not tracked in the API. User ID, all of this kind of stuff. And this is read-only, so I'm not actually trying to write or update or delete, although that is entirely possible. Just a little bit more complicated. And then you can see that when we're creating this, basically what we're doing is we're actually using the storage handler to go out and grab this stuff. And that's where we kind of start to go a little bit further down the rabbit hole. Okay. Any other questions before I go on?
So this is independent. We moved on from the module that you were showing off to us, and this is you doing a practical use case by coding.
Right. This is completely separate from the external entities module, and that's a really good point. All of this is just core with whatever custom stuff I'm doing. So there's nothing wacky or crazy. There's no dependencies here except Drupal 8. That's a good point. So on the other one, when it's kind of brittle sometimes and doesn't work, it's them. This one, when it's brittle and doesn't work, it's me. So that's how you can tell the difference. But let's take a look here. So you'll notice up here we've defined our storage handler, MTG card storage, and that is right here. So let's open this up. Okay. So actually, let me show you this. This is actually the way that I did this. And this kind of stuff, going through this stuff, even if you don't have like an explicit project or it's not something special for work, and you just have a little bit of extra time or you're going to take some time to just monkey around with something, the great thing about this is that it forces you to do that headfirst dive into the mud and just kind of start crawling through the code base. And that's where you start to learn things, and the holes in your knowledge start to get filled in with those gaps here and there. So what I did was I was originally trying to figure out how am I going to do this, and I was just using the core, where are we here, entity, here we go. I was using content entity storage base as my first draft that I was going through, which you can see extends entity storage base, which is pretty low level. But when I was playing around, what I noticed is that there was this content entity null storage. And so I opened that up, and it's like, oh wow, this thing is pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward, and it's basically like it nullifies everything. So I actually use this as my starting place because it does inherit from content entity storage base, but it's already getting rid of things, a lot of the stuff that I was going to have to figure out how to get rid of, and I knew that this was going to work, so I actually just copy-pasted into my storage handler and then started renaming stuff, started changing things. However, going through this process of trying to figure out which things inherit from what, and which methods are here, which ones are protected, which ones are abstract, which ones are still available, which ones do I have to have, what's going on in the background that is not present here I need to know about when we're creating an entity and pre-saving or post-loading, all of those fun things. Digging through the code was really helpful. So what we're doing here, and we can go down and we can look, basically when we're loading, and we'll take a look at this one, this is a pretty good option here. Basically when we're loading, we're using Guzzle to make a GET request out to that API. And you can see that we're passing in the ID. That's that Sarah-Angel or Fog or whatever that unique identifier is. At that point, we make the request, we get the JSON back, we use JSON decode to turn it into an array, and then that array is then passed through to just create the entity as the values array that be passed in. The one thing that I'm doing here is that because the image URL and the rarity were underneath something else, I wanted those to be back out so that they would map up, so that the field names in the API are the same as the field names on the entity itself. And those things merge together. Otherwise, it's all really straightforward. Now, for those that don't know, the way that Drupal typically works, and you'll notice that there's a load and a load multiple. Let me actually jump back over to content entity storage base, because what you'll see, let's see, where's load? Here we go. So what you'll see here is that load is simply calling load multiple. It's just only sending one thing through instead of a lot. And so all of the magic that's happening in Drupal by default is happening on load multiple. And you can see this is where we're doing stuff with caching. We're going through, and anything that wasn't cached but you need to go out and grab, you can then grab it after the fact, make sure all that stuff is there, you don't have anything extra, and then it returns it back. So by default, the way Drupal wants to work is it wants to use load multiple. It's going to come in and say, okay, I've got this list of entity IDs that I need to load. Of that list, 6 out of the 10 are cached, so we just grab those. The 4 that are left, we're going to load, we're going to add it back, make sure there's no duplicates, and then we're going to send you back those 10. This is the ideal way to work, but again, because the API doesn't work that way, I had to kind of go the opposite direction. And so the way that I had to do it was actually, I put most of my logic in the load function, and then load multiple is calling load the 20 times or whatever it might need to do. Again, less than ideal, but you got to work with what you got to work with. Let's see here. I also have a get all, which is what I was working on because when you pass through to load multiple, if you pass through null and you don't have any entity IDs, it's going to load all of them by default. So these are some of the things we have to kind of think about, because number one, I can do that, but if I've got an API that's got 10,000 things, I don't want to do that, right? So this is where I started playing with that, and I didn't make it too far. I do have the ability to go through and just grab the default API call, which I think returns 100 objects out of however many thousands there are. So the next thing on my list, as I keep working on this and playing with it, is to get paging in, and then a tighter integration with views and making all that stuff more seamless. So when I was passing this stuff through, there's still some weirdness going on. This is not working anywhere near as well as I want it to work. And one of the problems is that even though we're defining our own storage handler, the content entities, storage handler still somewhere is still wanting to try and talk to the database. And I haven't figured out where it is yet. I've taken out everything I can think of, but it's still trying to do that, so it's causing problems. So in this case, what should happen ideally, eventually when all this stuff works well, is that I take that array of values back from the API, the field IDs that for my entity match the field IDs in that array of values, and I just pass those through, and Drupal takes care of it. That's kind of working, but kind of not. So in this case, in order to make this work, because this is total demoware, I actually had to go through and map these out to actual properties on my entity so that I could pass those through to my template. So what you're seeing right here is a total hack job, and this is not the way that you want to do it, but sometimes you have to hack it to make it work. And then I left a note for myself here that I was dividing out all of the methods that are more important, particularly since this is a read-only, versus all of the methods that I'm really only are there just because I need a placeholder, or maybe I might need them later. And that's all of these, and you'll notice that they're all just empty. I mean, I only have read access to this API, so I can't delete anything. I don't have revisioning turned on, although that would be a really cool idea to do something like that. I don't have the ability to update or to create new ones. So all of that stuff is out of the way. And that was partially by design. I did see some code where somebody was doing a very simple version of pushing and pulling to their own API that was feeding a decoupled app, which was actually very cool. But I opted not to do that because I wanted to go for something a little bit simpler and just remove as many variables as possible. And it's pretty crazy enough as it stands. Awesome. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. And again, this is really such a great way to learn. A perfect example is the has data function on the storage handler. Does anybody, raise a hand, does anybody know what that's for? I didn't either. And it was false on the null, and I was like, well, that can't be right because there is data. So I changed it to true, which was great until going through and uninstalling and reinstalling the module, which you do 50 million times when you're writing a module, and it wouldn't uninstall because it says Drupal already has data for this thing. And I was like, no, there's not. There's no table. What are you doing? You're crazy. And then finally, after pulling my hair out, I realized that I was telling Drupal there was data, and there was always going to be data no matter what, even though there wasn't. But this is one of those things where you start to learn how those things work, and that figuring that out and going down that rabbit hole taught me a lot of other little things about how stuff works. I wasn't looking to go learn those things, but sometimes you do. And that's the advantage to all of this. So the other thing that we're doing here, now that we've got this storage handler in place, is that I actually did create a very simple controller that's actually spitting the stuff out on the page. So just to show you guys very quickly, and again, this is not what I would consider ideal, because I'm not doing this for some specific reason. I'm doing this because this was easier than trying to make all of the pieces line up nicely inside of Drupal itself. The pieces lining up nicely inside of Drupal itself would be better. So I defined my route. So as you can see here, card / whatever that ID is, as we saw earlier. It's going to my controller, which is up here, which is pretty simple. And all the controller does, and you can see I've commented out there where I was trying to get Drupal to render. I'm actually able to get the render array, but the data is not, the fields aren't lining up properly. And so when I go to my page, it's blank. It's like I know it's there, and I know you've got it, but you're not putting it out. So this is, again, one of those times where I was like, okay, we're just going to make this work. But you can see all I'm doing is I'm actually just taking that ID, and I'm loading that entity, which is actually creating the entity because it doesn't really exist. And then I'm returning it to a function, this build function method. And what that's doing is that's actually taking the data, passing it through to my actual theme, which is in hook theme, which then goes to my twig template so it can spit stuff out. At the end of the day, I'd say probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 hours, maybe 10 to 12 hours to get this far with the custom storage handler. I didn't spend anywhere near that amount of time. I think I spent maybe an hour on the external entities module, monkeying around with it, looking in the issue queue, finding the example, getting the example work great, and then I moved on to this. So my expectation is that with more time, I can refine this and make it better and easier, and then it shouldn't take anywhere near that long, right? Because now that I've gone through and done this once, I can do it again in a quarter of the time. Any other questions right now about this?
Just curious. I mean, could this be used as a way to syndicate content between Drupal sites?
Sure, although I did see in the external entities module, someone's asked that question. Like, how do I use this to tie into JSON coming from another Drupal site? That question hasn't been answered yet.
That or WordPress or Joomla, I mean, any other content management system would be prime for it.
Yeah. And
especially since you have the total CRUD API for pretty much all of those.
Well, and if you want to get really crazy, you could even go back to like let's say you had an old D6 site that you wanted to migrate, but you didn't want to migrate. You could actually set up some endpoints or do something crazy, and then just pull that stuff in, feed your stuff over, and then build out your site. And some of your legacy stuff would either stay there or would eventually be pruned and fall away.
Something like that was handy whenever I used to work at All Players and had the D6 and D7 talking to each other. That was...
Yeah, or think about like if you've got an e-commerce engine, like Magento, or there's a lot of good ones now that are SaaS offerings, and they have great APIs sometimes. It would be really awesome if you could go in and say, oh, hey, I'm making this page about this new shirt that we made, but all the information from the shirt's coming from over there, but I want to put it in my site, and I want to highlight, and when you click the button, I want to go over and add it to my cart. This would let you do that, and you wouldn't have to worry about any of that stuff.
So what are the pros and cons versus using the external entity module versus what you've done? What did you get feature-wise, other than insane amounts of customization?
Yeah.
Could you have done what you've done so far just purely in the external entity module?
Probably, because what I'm doing so
what's
far
gonna happen
isn't
next that's
right.
going to be the
Because what I'm doing right now isn't that difficult.
Okay.
I'm just doing the bare, the basic.
Okay.
But the other thing is, and if you go and look at the module, you'll see it's really powerful. The direction they're going in, like they're defining the plugins for the different. What were they called? It was either Wiki or the REST.
Right.
So I mean, they're building it out to be a really big, potentially robust thing if that happens.
Yeah.
But then again, do I want to rely on that, especially if it's dev?
You probably could have extended that and put a Magic the Garden
Sure.
gathering
No,
card
exactly.
consumption in
Right.
the dropdown, right?
And if that was
Use the rest of it.
if that was stable and supported,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
then it would have been probably way smarter to do that.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, there could be a lot of other things that you want to be doing with this entity outside of just
Right.
pulling in data.
Yeah.
Like you may have some business logic where you need to change things or alert people, or you might need to take that data and mash it up with other data and then stick it into your data. I mean, there's all kinds of other things you can do.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I was talking to someone recently about a pricing engine that this would be great for. You have this set of criteria that you're gathering, and then you shop it out to 15 different APIs from different companies.
That would be
and
awesome.
You give back pricing models for that, and you say which one of these is best, right?
yeah.
It's a shopper for you, right? So this would work really well because it's got to consume real-time data because the prices change.
Exactly.
And stuff like that. So,
Yeah, that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you, to what John was saying, if you had a product in Drupal, and those were references to those external sources, then you could actually cache and control everything there, and even add your own stuff. You could have comments, everything else, and then all of those individual calls to those services would be separate.
Right.
So that's a really interesting idea. Yes, sir.
Could you have a scraper behind an external entity, basically, rather if they don't have an API?
Oh, I mean, you can do anything. I mean, there's
Yeah.
services for that too that are out there. I'm trying to remember. There's one that's like Prismatic. Is that one or something like that? You can give it a URL and it will transform the HTML into an API. Things like that. But I don't see why not. I mean, that's the thing with Drupal, right? It's not can you do it? It's is that a good idea? Learned that lesson the hard way. Okay. So next steps, as I said before, this is some of the stuff that I'm going to keep playing with, and we need to dig more into query API options as a community, and we need to get more information overall about how this stuff works. We need to have better support in core. We've got the raw ability to do this stuff, but it's kind of no man's land right now. So there are probably at least a handful of potential bugs and edge cases that no one has discovered because no one's really doing this. I mean, there could have been some things that I could have been running across that I'm just not good enough to recognize the difference between my incompetence and Core's incompetence, right? I mean, so as we go through this, I'm hoping to see more people doing this and playing with it and raising the stakes and making everything better for everybody. Some tips again, if you guys are interested in playing with this yourself, definitely look at the storage handlers in code. One thing that I saw somebody else was doing that I didn't do here, but I thought was actually very clever, is instead of using the building my storage handler by extending the content entity storage handler, they were actually building on the key value storage handler, which in this case kind of makes a lot of sense. That could potentially limit some of my ability to query, but if, again, you know what that product ID is, or you know exactly what you're looking for, it's a lot simpler, a lot cleaner, and you certainly wouldn't have any of the database weirdness that I'm wrestling with.
So if you take the key value approach and Redis is installed, is it automatically going to start using that? Or I don't know how that handler or that,
It depends on where you tell it. I think you do that in settings.
Okay.
.php.
So it could get really fast at that point.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, you would probably, if you have Redis, you're probably going to want your cache to be served from Redis instead of from the database.
Yeah, that's okay.
So that's already fast. But then if you have, hey, I call this endpoint and I ask for this ID and I get this JSON back, well, that is a key value store.
Yep.
Now you're abstracting away with Drupal and you're making it easier. So that is probably the next thing I'm going to start playing with. That might have actually been a little bit easier and faster if I hadn't been so ambitious in trying to get something done. PHP Storm and Xdebug are like your best friends in the universe. I had a buddy of mine, Adam. He's actually the developer on the Lightning team for the Lightning distribution. And recently we were talking. I was like, yeah, I don't really do Xdebug that much. And he's like, what, do you use Kint or something? And I was like, yeah. And he said, that's like rubbing sticks together to make fire. Don't do that. There's a place for Kint. I still like it, but he was right. It did help a lot. And then the ability to have PHP Storm tell me when I was missing a call that I needed, to have it tell me what was I inheriting from, what else was available, where was it coming from. I mean, that kind of stuff. Instead of that 10 to 12 hours, it probably would have taken me like 30 if I hadn't killed myself first. So definitely a big one. And yeah, take some time with this. This is crazy. And it's not crazy in theory, and it's not crazy potentially in practice. It's crazy because it's not really done. So you're kind of hacking away in the jungle with a machete. So going into that, just know that that's what you're going into, and enjoy the experience, or you might throw your computer out a window. So, and people have been in my sessions before. I always like to give homework. Nobody likes homework, but that's okay. This one's pretty easy. Go play with the external entity module. That's going to take you like maybe 20, 30 minutes. I mean, come on. That's easy to do. Talk to people about this. Brainstorm and think of cool things. And share those ideas with other people. See if you can encourage other people to start talking about this and maybe doing sessions, maybe people who'll do a better one than me. And then we start to get those resources out there and people start playing with it. That's how this stuff grows. And then if you do actually have some time and you actually do start working on something, then contribute that back. I mean, if I continue to keep plugging away at this and make something that's actually usable, then I'll probably just make a module and I'll contribute it. Probably not because there are that many people who love Magic the Gathering that's the only thing that's keeping them from Drupal is that integration. But specifically because if we do have a decent working example, then people can say, oh, I've got this. Well, this isn't really, it works, but it's not that great. But I can do this, and now this is really awesome. And then that's how we grow. Any final questions? Was this helpful? It's a little weird.
It's great.
Kind of strange.
It's just it's another approach for sure.
Yeah.
Inspiring.
So I wonder how this could scale. In my use case, I could have just millions and millions of entities.
Yeah.
And I wonder at what point Drupal would get mad at me and go, hell no, you can't be caching that kind of quantity.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. But if you think about it, if you wanted to be able to make use of that information in Drupal, if you were to migrate that stuff in, that's wacky. That's taken a lot of time. That's taken a lot of space.
Well, that's a very understandable problem, though.
Yes.
I know to throw a bigger database server at that with more.
But here, you're actually what you're doing here is you're making it a lot more scalable, because really the only thing you have to worry about is how you're caching. So if you had Memcache or you had Redis,
Just bigger Redis memory allocation.
just add RAM, and RAM is cheaper than database storage and CPU cycles to manage the database, and the load on your entire system from having to deal with all of this plus the stuff that it's normally doing. So,
and it sort of begs the question then, what about cache warming those millions and millions of entities?
I think the other problem you're going to deal with is when you have APIs that have rate limiting on them.
No, that's absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm telling you. This is a whole new frontier in terms of what you can do, as well as in terms of the problems we're going to run into. That's exciting. New problems to solve. Who doesn't like that?
Cache until your limit's free again.
Yeah, exactly. Other questions? We're
So
good?
how does this all work into, I don't know if you've dealt with Views API and whatnot so far.
I have started down that path.
Okay.
The good news is that Entity API makes that a lot easier. The bad news is that it's going to almost always be custom to a certain extent, because you're going to have to tell Views how to communicate with that API, how to send the queries, how to do the paging. I don't think at the end of the day it's going to be too bad, but I haven't successfully done it, so I can't tell you.
So there's always going to be some kind of storage in your database, Drupal database, that's going to have the key to the API.
Potentially, or or file,
Like solar
config. You've got config storage as a file level, so But these are the questions, right? We got to figure it out, and we got to get people to play with it. Awesome.
Do you have a feel, speaking of Views, for how this compares to doing a Views query plugin, something of that nature?
Yeah, so that was one of my stretch goals I didn't make it to. Was originally what I'd hoped to do was to be able to have the module, the custom storage handler, and then have a plugin for Views that allows me just to query an API endpoint and return and display those things. That's also another really interesting approach. And I know some people have done things like that, but again, it's not easy to find. So, awesome. Well, thanks everybody. I'm going to hit the red button again.